you also have a podcast, quite a successful podcast, I might mention. Would you mind just talking a bit? What was your inspiration behind making that podcast? Actually, like,
I actually never wanted to do a podcast.
Never wanted.
It was never something I had on my plan of things to do, and it was during the kind of second year of COVID, and someone, a devotee friend of mine, said, maybe we could do a podcast, and Narada, you could present it. And I was like, all right, well, we'll see how it goes. And that was 3 years ago.
Okay.
And I've just recorded episode 112.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's 112 interviews with devotees all over the world, sharing their stories. And I've got to be honest, I don't want to offend any of the first 10 guests, but I find the first 10 episodes a bit boring. That sounds terrible when you look at who the guests were. And it wasn't about the guests, it was just that I was following a very rigid framework in terms of who I could invite onto the show and what I could ask them. And when we got to episode 11, I thought, I'm going to just ramp it up a bit. I'm going to invite who I want to invite, and I'm going to ask them within reason any question I want.
Make it a bit more exciting.
Yeah. And now, each episode is getting 2,000-3,000 views a week.
Wow.
I'm getting devotees emailing me to ask to be on the podcast.
Wow.
And I've got like a backlog or a list, a queue. And, you know, those of you that listen to the Hare Krishna Project podcast know that we've covered some controversial topics. And sadly, if I can use that term, it's the most controversial topics that get the most views.
Right.
You know.
Well, that content's not covered so widely, so naturally, yeah. But that's a nice service that you do, to go deep into things that people are not usually talking about. That's nice. That's nice. Do you get what do you call it? Not feedback, but criticism? You get criticism?
I get feedback,
Backlash?
Criticism, a little bit of hate mail.
Wow, hate mail.
I mean, hate mail is a strong expression, a strong
threats.
term. I've received some very unpleasant messages.
Wow.
Particularly when certain topics are discussed. And I've received only probably 2 messages in 3 years that have been threatening to my life.
To your life, even?
You know, that I'm going to be... Yeah.
Okay.
Sorted out and stuff.
That didn't deter you from making the podcast?
No, it didn't. It actually encouraged me to carry on.
Okay, yeah.
Because I knew I was making a difference.
Yeah.
And you know that if you're when your critics, when you get more criticism, you know that you're making a difference.
Right.
And what I find really interesting is even my critics now know what I stand for. And that's when you know you've really made a difference.
Right, that means that people are hearing.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I find quite interesting is that so the Hare Krishna Project, the initiative I run, and the podcast I produce, I have banged on about inclusion for years. That's like my thing, inclusion. Yeah. I want to include people, even people I disagree with, I want to include them. Prabhupada's movement, Lord Chaitanya's movement is for everyone, not just a select group of people or a certain number of people or a certain type of person.
Right.
So even my critics, they say online, well, that Narada, he's the one that goes on about inclusion all the time. No. You know, I just laugh.
Right.
Yes, you've got it. That's what I want to be known for. That's my contribution to Srila Prabhupada's mission.
Right.
I try to include people.
Right. That's good. The ears are open.
Yeah.
So also, it's interesting because you're also like a historian. You consider yourself a historian, or how? Because you wrote this book.
Yeah.
The Hare Krishnas in Britain.
Yeah.
It's kind of a historical book.
A little bit, yeah.
Is it? Do you consider yourself a historian?
You know, I used to mess around in my history lessons at school.
And you wouldn't pay attention.
I wouldn't pay attention, and I found it a bit boring. And I remember, you know, my history teacher having a go at me often about not paying attention and chatting to people and messing around in class. But would I consider myself a historian? A little bit. I would consider myself more of a sociologist. So in the movement, in the Hare Krishna movement, you've got philosophers and theologians and troublemakers and people that love certain things. But I'm a sociologist. I'm interested in groups of people and social groups of people and why they do what they do. So the book I wrote, The Hare Krishnas in Britain, wasn't about necessarily the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, but that's a bit there, or the theology, which is a word we don't often use in the movement. There was a bit about the history, it was more about the sociology. Who are the Hare Krishna groups and mats and sects, and how do they fit together? But when I started the research for that book, I realized I couldn't just dive in with, hey, you've got ISKCON and Bliss and the International Pure Bhakti Yoga Society and the Radha Kripa Mission and let's do another one, the Sri Gopinath Gaudiya Mat. I couldn't just name them. I had to put them into context. So I did some research on the history of the Hare Krishna movement in Britain. And it wasn't originally meant to be part of the book, but in the end it got there. There's a whole chapter on the 1930s. There was a very significant Hare Krishna movement in Britain from 1933 to 1937. A lot of the listeners may know or may not know that Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Sarasvati Thakur sent actually 5 of his disciples, not 3, 5 disciples to Britain in the 1930s to spread Bhakti Yoga. And they were successful in terms of how we label or understand success. They were successful. They opened a temple in Kensington. They were having programs every evening. There was at least 7 Westerners were initiated into the Gaudiya tradition. So, and I just became interested in that because I think no one else was talking about it. You know, my background is in ISKCON, and certainly what I was taught or told when I joined 20 years ago, well, there was a few devotees in London in the 30s and they attracted 2 ladies to Krishna consciousness, but they weren't very successful. But when you actually do your own research and you look into it, they were incredibly successful. The Gaudiya Mission UK, which is the oldest mat in Britain, has just marked its 90th birthday. It's been in Britain for 90 years. That doesn't sound like unsuccess to me or something that's not successful. So I've become an historian by default, and people just ask me questions about what happened here and there, and I try and give them an answer.
So it's just because of your natural curiosity for what is actually the interest that piques what piques your interest about the interaction between these different groups of Hare Krishnas specifically. Maybe I should ask more specifically what interests you in Hare Krishna to begin with. Let's go a little beyond that.
Okay.
Maybe that will help to answer.
Okay, so I wasn't raised a Hare Krishna devotee. I'm from a white working class background in Somerset, and we were raised nominally Methodist. So when I say nominally, I mean kind of in name only or in whatever only. A lot of people are nominally Anglican, which means, oh yeah, we go to church for christenings and weddings and funerals. So the Methodists are a non-conformist Protestant group. So I was raised, they're a bit more chilled, a bit more kind of liberal in theology. So I was raised in them. And I had a great time, actually. I really appreciated it. But when I was around 15, 16, my grandmother passed away. And I was raised by my mother and grandmother. When something like that happens in your life, you start to really question reality, your understanding of reality. You know, where is my grandmother? Where is she gone? And things like that. And around that age, I took an interest in religion and philosophy. And I started going to church, and I loved it, actually. I had a wonderful time, and I went to university and did a degree in comparative religion. So I didn't study theology in terms of the study of God or the belief systems around God. I studied comparative religion. All these religions. I was just interested in religions, you know.
That's weird now. In this day and age,
Yeah.
it's weird to be interested in religions.
Yeah. And I loved it. My 3-year degree, I would love to do again. I studied Christianity and Hinduism and Sikhism and Judaism and the Mormons and the Unification Church and the Raelian movement, which is a UFO type cult.
Wow.
And in the same week, in my 2nd year, I had a lecture on the Church of Scientology. And the next day, I went to a lecture about ISKCON. And it was particularly ISKCON, not Gaudiya Vaishnavism or Bhakti Yoga. It was on ISKCON. And then I was sent to an ISKCON temple in London in April 2004, so almost 20 years ago, to study the Hare Krishnas, but not to join. You're meant to sit there and take notes, and you can get involved if you want to. I mean, this is the short story. I did get involved in the end, and that was 20 years ago. But for me, I remember particularly reading the Bhagavad Gita as it is. And that's Srila Prabhupada's translation. There's hundreds of translations of the Gita. And I would remember feeling very amazed and overwhelmed by what the Bhagavad Gita talked about and what it was saying. Because for me, I've always been into, let's try and work together. Let's try and get along. I mean, I've been into inclusion and collaborative working and since I was young for different reasons. You know, I don't like division. That sounds a bit namby-pamby. I like people to get on. Why do
Naturally.
people have to argue all the time?
Right.
You know, and so I remember in my head I was trying to work out with all these religions. I think they're all possibly true because they're all kind of pointing to the same thing. They're just doing it in a different way. But I need to try and work out how they're all true. And I remember reading the Bhagavad Gita as it is. I was sitting in a Hare Krishna temple in London one day, and there was that line in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna says, whenever there is a decline in kind of religious activities on earth, I will descend myself.
Yada yada hi dharmasya glane bharati bhavata. Yeah, I think my Sanskrit is very bad there, but
It's great having a scholar in the podcast as well. So Krishna says, whenever there is a rise in immorality,
yeah, irreligion.
irreligion,
Yeah.
and I will descend myself, or I will send one of my representatives. And when I read that verse in scripture, everything clicked. It was like, yes,
Right.
these are all messengers of God, or they're
Jesus,
God.
Muhammad, these are all
Jesus, Muhammad.
Yeah.
You know, I forgot the founder of the Zoroastrian religion, it was so long ago, but they're all kind of saying the same thing. But because I'm a man, and because I'm a Westerner, I wanted to put everything into boxes. Well, I wanted to all fit in my head. And I remember reading about just, and I'm actually, this is a good plug, I'm halfway through reading Bliss's book on teachings of the Lord Buddha.
Oh, okay.
The Vedic point of view.
Thank you.
And so in my head, I was thinking 20 years ago, sitting in this temple, well, where does Buddhism fit into this? You know, I want to include the Buddhists because they're most of the time peaceful and kind and caring.
That was the missing piece.
And then when you read that in traditional Vaishnava theology, Buddha is actually an incarnation or avatar of Vishnu or Krishna.
Right.
That's it.
Wow.
It all clicked.
The last piece of the jigsaw.
And actually, for me, it might be that other religions and spiritual paths teach the same thing. The Baha'is teach a very similar thing, that actually all the prophets are true in its progressive revelation. Every era or every time, God reveals something new or different or just reminds us of the original message of God consciousness. But I've discovered that message in Gaudiya Vaishnavism and the teachings of Srila Prabhupada. And for me, that was what really sucked me in, was that message of theological inclusion. These are all these divine beings and personalities and Shakti Avesh avatars are all included in the same love story, if you like, between the divine and us.
Right. That's nice. You saw the connection
Yes.
between everything.
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. So that was 20 years ago.
20 years ago.
Okay.
Man and boy.
Okay.
I feel old when I say 20 years ago.
Well, no, you don't look old though. So
I'm turning
it's done
40
well.
in July. I don't like a day over 39, I know that.
The Hare Krishna practice is working, I see.
Yeah, I hope. Whatever.
What is your what has been your involvement, because you wrote this book,
Yeah.
you're interested from a philosophical point of view, so what has been your involvement in the movement since that time? Has it changed? What have you...
Yeah, well, to be really honest, I mean, a lot of, some of the viewers may know this, for most of those 20 years I served in ISKCON, and I had a fantastic time in ISKCON, if I'm honest. I think, and I'm very grateful to a lot of devotees in ISKCON for opening up opportunities for me and giving me chances. And for a good decade of that, I served as part of a festival program. So we would travel around the country and around Europe, organising Hare Krishna festivals. And one of the benefits in that program was that I learned a lot about how to organise a festival, how to try and do outreach, how to engage with the public, a little bit about how to engage with the media. But I learned about that in my kind of other kind of secular life, I guess. But I served in terms of working with the public, and the challenge was we'll go to a different town or village or city every week and organise a Hare Krishna festival in a town hall and explain to ordinary, everyday Western people the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita, the philosophy of the Bhagavatam. And that was my main service for about a decade.
Okay.
And I learned a lot. And a lot of devotees, some of the devotees listening to this will know me from those days, all those days ago.
as the director of the festivals.
Well, I wasn't the director, but I did a lot of the organisation behind the
Okay.
scenes.
Okay.
There was a period of time when I probably directed most of it, right about 90%.
Wow.
And I just told people where they needed to be at different times. You know, I booked
Okay.
the hall. This is the date. This is the time. This is when we're doing the Harinam. This is, you know, I designed the poster. You know, sent it to the printers, liaise with the media, and yeah, that's what I did for about a decade.
Okay. It sounds like an immense amount of work to be able to organize so many devotees and like organize something like that. Is it an immense amount of work?
Well, I was trying to think of a joke then about organising devotees, because actually organising devotees isn't easy for
It's
a whole
more-
number of reasons.
It's more difficult than organizing normal people.
I'd say so.
Wow. Okay. Why is that?
I mean this in the nicest possible way. I'm going to offend everyone listening now. Hare Krishna devotees, in my experience, are the worst group of people to organise. And why is that? Maybe because they're so transfixed on prema, on bhakti, on transcendental activities, they don't know what the time is, or they don't know what the day is. Or when I say I'm picking you up at 10 a.m, I mean 10 a.m, not 11:30 or 12, you know, this is the schedule, you know. Oh yeah, but I just arrive when I want. So I'm sorry to offend people, but I find it very difficult
Okay.
to organise people. But it was an experience.
It seems contradictory because you have they're the most, externally speaking, they look very organized. They wear all the same clothes. They have all the same haircuts.
Yeah.
And they all the same face painting. They eat the same. They speak the same, even in many instances. So it seems like they're the most organized people. But I guess it's just the idea of reincarnation gives this kind of relaxed feeling to everything that they do. I heard a similar thing happens in India. The Indian people are quite difficult to organize or make firm dates or times with because of this reincarnation principle being somewhere in the consciousness. But I don't know, maybe not.
I don't know why it is, but unfortunately it is. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so they're difficult to organize.
Yeah.
But still you managed to do it.
Yeah, and I remember one year. I mean, for several years, maybe 3 or 4 years in a row, we were organising 50 festivals a year, 50 events a year.
Wow.
So some of them were big festivals in halls, some of them were talks in libraries, some of them were school programs, some of them were big Harinams in cities. But I went for several years of organising 50 events a year.
Wow.
And I think your question just now was how did I find the time to do it, or
Yeah, how did you organize it? Because it seems...
Well, I decided a long time ago I didn't want to get married. I decided in my 20s I didn't want children, and I think of I've got 3 brothers, none of them are devotees. I've got friends that are not devotees and they got married with kids, and I think about understandably how their life revolves around their partner and their kids, and you never see them, they never get time to go out, you know. Not criticising that lifestyle, but because literally I've only had to look after myself, make sure that I had money in the bank to put fuel in the van or to feed myself, I didn't have to worry about things.
Bit more freedom.
So I could literally get up early every morning and chant my rounds, organise the next festival. I could stay up late. I could, you know, I've always also kind of in a secular capacity, which means non-religious. I've always been self-employed, so I earn my money through selling my talents to businesses. And so I haven't had to go to an office 9 to 5 every day. You know, I could just like be at home and tell my clients, oh, I'm working and I'm actually organising a Hare Krishna festival. You know, so that's I just fitted it in, and I was so enthusiastic about the service and so passionate about Srila Prabhupada, and I knew that from my perspective, if Srila Prabhupada could inspire me and change me, just an ordinary everyday sinner, why couldn't he inspire other people?
Wow, that's a nice mentality.
Yeah. So he's saved a hopeless sinner like me. Why can't Prabhupada save other people? And Prabhupada can.
Yes. And
Prabhupada came, you know, if we look at the sacrifices that Prabhupada made in the 60s and 70s, they are remarkable. And I think about, you know, me being almost 40 and being a bit tired. Well, Prabhupada started his mission in the West at the age of 69, 70 on 3 hours sleep a night. Who am I to complain about being tired?
Right. He always sets a standard.
Yeah, sets a standard that I will never reach in this life. Never any life, probably. But I try.
You have a nice, I won't say passion, because actually the word passion in the context of Hare Krishna is not actually a very good word, really. but
enthusiasm, zest.
You have a devout enthusiasm for Srila Prabhupada, and I appreciate that because Srila Prabhupada is a very remarkable personality, a very special personality, and sometimes it's not always brought, I think, to the light that it deserves, Srila Prabhupada's significance. So maybe you'd like to talk about Srila Prabhupada and your relationship with Srila Prabhupada, if you would.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, I guess it goes back to the time I was reading the Bhagavad Gita as it is 20 years ago,
right.
And it was Prabhupada's words explaining the verses in scriptures in terms of how everything theologically fitted together. That was probably the first time that I really felt connected to Prabhupada in that way, that Prabhupada's words, someone that physically I don't think I ever met, not less than a previous, I mean, I appeared in this body in 1984, maybe in a previous life I met Prabhupada, but certainly in this body I never met Prabhupada. And so how could someone that I'd never met physically inspire me in that way? So that was the first major connection. And for me in my younger years, I was like a lot of Western people. I was interested in things that I shouldn't have been interested in.
As we are.
Yeah, as we are, very attached or very passionate about things we shouldn't necessarily be passionate about. And how could, on the surface of it, or on the face of it, a man who was in an Indian body, born in 1896, come to the West and inspire someone like me? So when I really connected to that, I felt quite overwhelmed by that connection. And so that's kind of my connection with Prabhupada. And when I was writing this book, The Hare Krishnas in Britain, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, thank you for plugging, one of the things that I really wanted to try and identify, looking at the different mats and the sanghas in Britain, is what do they have in common? What do they have in common? And one of the few things, I mean, there's things like, prasadam, and we don't eat meat, and
chanting Hare Krishna.
Yeah, chanting Hare Krishna. There'll be differences in the number of rounds every day, but chanting that mantra, the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, is great. But the other thing that they all had in common was a great level of respect and reverence for Srila Prabhupada. There may have been differences of opinion over the status of Prabhupada,
right,
and whether we use terms like Diksha or Shiksha, but ultimately there was that respect, that very human level of respect actually, for Srila Prabhupada and his mission. And everyone that I met felt inspired by Srila Prabhupada, whether they were actually disciples of Sridhar Maharaj or Narayan Maharaj or Puri Maharaj or Govinda Maharaj or any other Maharaj. They were all inspired by Srila Prabhupada, and they read Prabhupada's books, and they were inspired by the example that he set. So Prabhupada, I picked up during my years of research for that book, that he was a unifying figure. Everyone respected and regarded him on a very high level.
All permeating respect wherever you go. Srila Prabhupada is recognized, practically speaking.
Oh yeah. And nobody could disagree with the sacrifices that he made in the 60s and 70s. Well, because factually it's true. He did go to America and he did do these things and he opened these temples and attracted this number of disciples. So factually it's all true. Right. But yeah, that example that he set, everyone just found it hugely inspiring. Right.
It's interesting because, Srila Prabhupada is inspiring, and he's inspiring so many people, even up till now. You just read his books, as you did. You're getting inspired. So, but there still exists a rift. Is rift the right word?
Schism.
There's a schism between the major organizations of Krishna consciousness that currently operate regarding, as you mentioned, the status of Srila Prabhupada. So, what do you think about that? Because I know you're also, as you mentioned, you have this very prolific, if I can use the word, podcast. You interview so many different people with different viewpoints. After interviewing so many different people, after looking at different angles of vision, what do you make of that concept?
My first reaction to your question is I actually think it's a great shame there's so much division, and there's a schism. It's a great word, schism. So it's a scholarly term which means religious division, I think.
Oh, really? So it's even pertaining to religions?
Particularly refers to religions, I think.
Wow.
So schisms.
Okay.
Extra
points for you.
Thanks to a member of the technical team over there in the corner who came up with that term. Can you repeat the question again? Because
yes. I don't want to cut you off there. Prabhupada is all-pervadingly respected. He's inspiring people from even different institutions, different mats, different traditions even. I was actually watching what are they called? Sri Sampradaya, followers of Ramanujacharya. Even they are, respecting Srila Prabhupada in the context of some philosophical discussion that was. So that's a different Sampradaya. So Srila Prabhupada is respected everywhere. And you are quite a unique personality in the sense that I don't think there are many people who have had such an opportunity to kind of pick the brain of many people who have many different viewpoints regarding Srila Prabhupada's vision because of a philosophical understanding or a different institutional upbringing or different relationship they have with Srila Prabhupada. So after picking all those people's brains, what do you make of Srila Prabhupada's position?
My initial reaction is that if we want something or someone to bring us together, it is Srila Prabhupada. There is so much division around the devotion to Srila Prabhupada. That's an interesting expression, isn't it? Everyone's devoted to Prabhupada, but there is unfortunately this, in some wings of the Hare Krishna movement, there is this militant approach to devotion to Prabhupada that we are right and you are wrong.
Right.
That's a whole other conversation. But I think it's a great shame that mats can't work together more, can't be more. They don't have to be unified really necessarily, but just collaborate. The example I used in my book, The Hare Krishnas in Britain, was in my conclusion. I talked about the example we find in Britain of something called churches together or Christians together. So up and down the UK, in towns and villages and cities, you'll have little informal groups called churches together. Well, in a village you'll have Methodists and Catholics and Baptists and Anglicans, and they get together 3 times a year to pray together, to worship God together, to break bread together. They put aside their differences, they agree on the songs that they like, and they come together and they sing and they chant and they whatever.
Oh, that's nice.
But they're not asked to lose their individuality. They're not asked to turn away from their denominations or give up their certain hymn books or give up their way that they do things on a Sunday. They're allowed to keep their personalities as institutions.
Right.
And that's what I'd love to see. And unfortunately, we're a long way from this. Where is mats just coming together once a year to chant the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra together, coming together to, on certain festival days like Gaura Purnima or Janmashtami, focus on the things that we have in common. One of the challenges for me actually with my podcast, and I'd like to think I've done a good job, I'm kind of blowing my own trumpet here,
Yeah, you have.
is that I've tried to be as neutral as possible.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's very difficult to be neutral. You have to come off the fence and agree or disagree with something. But I've interviewed 112 people, and some of them had radically different opinions on issues.
Diametrically opposed.
Absolutely, and some of them have been a real challenge for me as to whether I would interview them or not, and I have. So I've had to come out of my comfort zone. I remember around episode number 50, I really was thinking, well, is this podcast going to carry on? Do I have time to do it? And then something happened, maybe astrologically or spiritually, that it just picked up. And I started having all these guests that wanted to be on the podcast, and we started running with it. What I find is really interesting after each podcast is I always get feedback, I always get responses, but every now and then, somebody okay, I'll give an example. So I've recently interviewed the leader of the ISKM, which is the International Sri Krishna Mandir.
Yeah.
I'm using this as an example because I hope the followers of the ISKM don't get upset because I don't want to upset anybody. And after, one of the followers messaged me and said, "Hey Narada, thank you so much for interviewing our leader. We really appreciated it. If we come to the UK, can you help us organise an event? Can we do some events with you and everything?" And a few of the other mats have said that. Oh, it's so great what you're doing. Can we organise different things and that? I think ISKCON Inc. was another one. You know, and I kind of quietly explained to them, but actually, I really loved interviewing so-and-so, but your particular philosophical persuasion might not be my personal one. You know, and I sent someone a message recently. I was very nice, and he took it in a nice way. Is that I've sat on the fence, but actually personally I might disagree with you on those certain topics.
Right.
But I'm really pleased that you think I agree with you, because I'm doing a good job. You know, and several mats over the last 6 months have asked me to join them or help with fundraising or get involved, and you know, because I've appeared as if I'm one of them, and I'm not now saying that I'm lying, and I'm not, but I've tried to take an interest in them. I've been enthusiastic about them, you know, and yeah, and I really appreciated that kind of service. But and most of those big characters I've had on the podcast have been people that have taken shelter of Prabhupada, but they have a very different view to a guest a week later that also follows Prabhupada. You know, it's kind of like the Christians, isn't it? Like they will you can ask 100 Christians to read the Bible and have 100 different views.
Oh yeah, and there are.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this is my personal view, it's the same with Prabhupada's teachings. You know, 25 Hare Krishna devotees that follow the teachings of Prabhupada can read Prabhupada's teachings and get a different view on what Prabhupada's talking about.
You're in quite a veteran podcaster, I would say, comparatively speaking, because back in my prime time, we were doing Bliss Podcast. I don't want to do a shameless self-plug here.
You can, this is your podcast.
Yeah, I can, yeah. We had 80 podcasts, I think.
That's really good.
It's not quite as good as you, though. So you're a bit more advanced, even including these new podcasts that we've recorded. So I just want to ask you, because how do you remain aloof, you know, from getting involved, even emotionally or whatever, in that conversation when there's someone who's like possibly quite not opposed, but has such a radically different viewpoint to you? How do you separate yourself? How do you remain objective?
Okay, that's a really good question, actually. One of the things I've loved about this podcast today is you didn't give me any of the questions in advance, so I've really had to think. I would say think on my feet, think on my sitting down on the floor.
I think it was a floor, actually. But
there's a number of ways to do that, and it's not actually easy to do it. So the first thing is I always write the questions in advance for the guests, and I email them to them, so they've got 4 or 5 days to really think about the answers. I always really, in terms of my facial expressions, I always really try and remain neutral,
like
or
this,
look
like a
neutral.
blank slate?
Yeah, blank slate. And also I remind myself, because some of the guests, they've said stuff and it's really rattled me internally. I can't believe he or she has just said that.
And you just keep.
And I'm there really, really kind of numb, or looking very kind of empty void. And I'm really thinking, I'm looking at the time, and I'm trying to take my mind off of what they've just said.
Okay.
So I'll give you an example. I won't say which podcast it was, but I recorded a podcast last year with a person, and we were talking about a really, really important topic, an incredibly controversial topic, a topic about something very personal to that person.
Okay.
It's one of my most viewed podcasts, and it was so important that we did that podcast to share that person's story with the world. During that podcast, we were talking about that particular issue. I won't narrow it down and say what it was. And then all of a sudden, the guest wanted to tell me that the British royal family were lizards.
Oh.
And I'm there.
That's quite shocking.
This has nothing to do with what we're talking about. There might be a very indirect link, but I really didn't think we were going to talk about this today. And I'm sitting there thinking,
how to handle it.
And then after that, I said, and what were you saying about the other thing? And you see, so firstly, that statement was completely not linked with anything we were talking about. Secondly, okay, I'm going to come off the fence. I'm a bit of, personally, I can't believe I'm admitting this on the Hare Krishna podcast. I'm a little bit of a royalist. on my personal political views.
Royalist, I'm going to have to get clarification.
Yeah, I support Britain having a constitutional monarchy. I think it's good for the country for lots of reasons.
It's Vedic.
It's actually Vedic. I was a big fan of Queen Elizabeth II. I think she was a great leader for the country. Yes, it was only ceremonial. I don't want Britain to have an elected president. So I wasn't going to go on and say that on the podcast because it completely would have gone off on a massive tangent.
Right, you don't know what he's going
and it was like my brain was thinking, well, let's just get back to the topic.
Right.
So I have to try and stick to the questions. The other thing I try and do, and it's really not easy because there's a lot of this in the Hare Krishna movement, I try to not interview conspiracy theorists or people who I know have very public conspiracy theory views.
Right.
That's not about me agreeing or disagreeing. I don't want to talk about whether the Earth's flat or not. I don't want to talk about whether the British royal family are lizards. I don't want to talk about anything that might go off and make the podcast look like we've deviated.
Right.
So I try and steer clear of topics that are too fringy. Now, the Hare Krishna movement is a bit fringy.
It's fringy by nature.
In terms of its place in wider society.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I try and steer clear of those fringe topics. Like, I've just done a podcast on self-healing. It was very good. And it was really important about how, everything's in, the power of the mind. And it was really good. But I've had 3 emails since from devotees. Oh, can you interview me? My mother's a devotee and she healed herself from breast cancer, which is fantastic. But I don't want to go down, and that's an important topic, by the way. I don't want to dismiss that at all. But I don't want to go down this route of just kind of focusing on that. So I try and stay aloof. I try and detach myself from the emotions. I think, well, I keep looking at the clock. Oh, I'm getting a bit hungry. I'm going to have that later. What am I doing tomorrow? And you don't know what's going on in my brain. But every now and then what challenges me is the guest will ask me a question.
Okay.
And I remember one podcast, I said to her, "You want me to answer that?" And it was a question where I would have to come off the fence. And I remember that particular, I can't remember what it was, but I didn't give an answer. Recently, when I interviewed the leader of the ISKM, he asked me that direct question, and it kind of threw me. And I went, tell us a bit more about, Okay. So it's a challenge. It's been a challenge to remain aloof and remain detached. For me, it's a savor. The savor is sharing devotees' stories with the world. Everyone has a story to tell.
Right, regardless of the view.
Regardless of whom or where they're from or their guru or whatever. What is your story and how can we share it with the world?
Yeah, I was going to ask actually about these because I was watching one podcast you did. I don't want to name anyone, but it piqued my interest because I was thinking, well, this is pretty wild content. Do you ever feel that when you're when people are speaking about particular theories, like I can talk about what the person talks about, but they were talking about like satanic rituals in ISKCON and so on. Do you believe in it? Do you believe that that's true? How do you feel towards those topics? Is there any point where you're like, wow, maybe that person's making some good points?
So I don't have an official vetting process for the podcast. That's been actually, this is the first time I'm saying this. It's one of the few criticisms of my podcast. Is that I don't vet the guests. So I don't have an official vetting system. So for example, ISKCON is the biggest Gaudiya Vaishnava group in the world. I think, let's say somebody messaged me from ISKCON Italy to say, can I be on the podcast? I'm not going to spend hours then messaging every member of ISKCON Italy. Oh, what do you think about Tony? Or whatever. I'm not time. I have to trust them.
Right.
I have to treat them mature and be respectful. So I don't necessarily have a vetting system, but I will try and find out something about someone. So that particular one on satanic ritual abuse, very similar to the other podcast I did last July about child abuse in ISKCON.
Right.
I was aware of those devotees. I knew those 2 ladies already. Their stories had been public for a long time.
Yeah.
And they had already shared their stories in public forums.
Okay.
So the satanic ritual abuse one, she had talked about her story a lot already.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like she was going to make up a story and talk about it. And I have heard about that from other corners of the Hare Krishna movement about satanic ritual abuse. So it's kind of like if you're doing a police investigation. let's think of an example.
Have you ever done one of those?
No, no. But let's say a man stole some cheese from the shop up the road.
Okay.
And he ran up the road with this big block of cheese. And the police interviewed one person and said, yes, I only saw a man with a block of cheese run up the road. Well, we've only got one witness statement and we're not really sure if it's true. But if 10 people gave the same story that, yeah, he was definitely had a block of cheese on the same road at 4:05 p.m. on Tuesday, it increases the likelihood of it being true in terms of how we understand truth in this context.
Right.
So this particular devotee has been sharing her story for years about being the victim of satanic ritual abuse in ISKCON, and other people have also shared their stories. And the other woman who was trafficked around ISKCON as a child for sex, I interviewed her last July. I think it was July. Her story had been public for several years, and I had heard about other guru coolies who are now my age or older,
right,
who had almost the same experiences. And I have a friend who unfortunately was sexually abused as a child by her father and then her stepfather. And the way she behaves today as a woman, in terms of her mental health difficulties, is exactly the same as this other woman who lives on the other side of the world who she's never met. So I had to kind of pair up myself in my head. Well, this is probably true based on this, and this.
Okay.
But I can't vet everybody, because I also feel like I'm doing a disservice or I'm being offensive. I don't trust you, you know. So I need to check that what you're saying is true.
Right.
Some podcasts, they've said stuff and I think, wish this hadn't happened. You know, they come up with this very bizarre comment.
Can you give me one example?
Well, there was the one about the royal family being
the lizards. That is pretty shocking. There
was another guy that I interviewed, that narrows it down, it was a guy, and his story was just so far out that he had a dream, and Prabhupada had revealed to him in a dream that he could smoke marijuana, and he had a marijuana farm, and that might be true in terms of he has a marijuana farm, and he might have had that dream, but that's the whole issue of dreams then, and how truthful are dreams, and I just, yeah.
It's a difficult thing, because when you're, is representing the right word? You're part of the Hare Krishna movement.
Yeah.
So, and Hare Krishna movement is, you know, from a philosophical point of view, it is a very important movement. It's presenting the law books, as Srila Prabhupada said, for the next 10,000 years. It's a possibility for people to get out of the material world, so it's quite a big deal. And then, at least this is how I feel, if you're doing podcasting, it's, and that's actually why we didn't have guests on our podcast for a long time, was that because we were just worried that, you know, we don't know what they're going to say, and you're presenting it to the world, and who knows what they're going to say, and people might take that as, you know, some kind of evidence for their own activities which might not be bona fide. So
and that's been a second criticism of the Hare Krishna Project podcast, is that I'm airing our dirty laundry to the world, and I get that, but I think because in my other life I work in media and communications and journalism, and you know, I believe as much as possible is in transparency and fairness, and sharing people's stories and writing articles. And I completely accept that people are going to Google, you know, if you Google, I Googled myself the other day with my name, no, I didn't Google I Googled something like transphobia in the Hare Krishna movement. And actually a lot of me came up, because I've done a lot of work on including all people, including trans people. At least 3 of my guests have been trans devotees in terms of how they label or describe themselves. So I was quite chuffed that I came up towards the top. You know, looking if a student's doing a dissertation on trans issues in the Hare Krishna movement, they'll come up with Narada Prabhu.
Citing you.
Well, he said, you know, when it's online, it's always online. But that's one of the criticisms, is you're airing your dirty laundry in public. And I remember I made a film, must have been 2 years ago now, heavily criticising one of the gurus in ISKCON, who is not only a paedophile, he's admitted to being a paedophile, but yet he's still allowed to be a guru in ISKCON. Shocking. And I had so much negativity from members of ISKCON privately. You know, I don't respond to it. I've never had any sleepless nights, thankfully. I just get on with my life.
Even the death threats?
No. For about 10 minutes I get quite worried, but then I realise they don't know where I live.
Step one.
You know, and then you however we define reality, I'd kind of step back into reality. What is reality?
Right.
Well, for me, Krishna consciousness is a massive part of my life, and I couldn't imagine it any different. But my paid employment has nothing to do with the Hare Krishna movement. But I'm not going to lose my job. My family are not Hare Krishna devotees. You know, my mum still loves me. My mum will always love me, regardless if I interview on my podcast. My mum doesn't really care who I interview on the podcast. So in reality, things are still going to be fine. At the end of the day, everything's still going to be fine.
Right.
You know, even when I receive these negative messages. So that's been another criticism, is that I'm airing dirty laundry. But I have to say, as a result, it's at the moment we're getting more views than our nearest competitors. Mm-hmm. You know, I've got a competitor in America who also produces podcasts.
Okay, I think I know.
You know, and he's done very well. But he's struggling since he's made a return, and you know, I seem to be getting guests that are edgy.
And you think that's because of the unbridled approach to just not having a vetting process per se, and
well, there's a bit of criteria.
Mm-hmm.
What's the plural of criteria? Criterion.
Yeah.
So you need to be a practitioner of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So you need to be within a recognized mat or links to a recognized mat in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, such as Bliss.
Is it a recognized mat? Okay.
It's recognized by the Hare Krishnas in Britain official book. Of course it's a recognized book. You're following a bona fide process. You're following Srila Prabhupada. Nothing more bona fide than that. So you need to be a practitioner of Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Okay.
I've never had any non-Gaudiya Vaishnava guests yet. And the other two...
Planning on it?
I've got a few scholars that I'm not aware of. Professor Kim Knott. Someone told me once she was a disciple of Naraya Maharaj, but I've never had that verified. Professor Kim Knott. Dr. David Barrett, he wrote a book 20 years ago on ISKCON. So, you know, if they're still alive. Sorry, I think Professor Kim Knott's still alive. I hope. I interview them from more of a kind of, you know, academic point of view. And then there's groups of people that I don't interview. I have some principles. Okay. I'm not a complete wishy-washy liberal. So I don't interview known child abusers. Of course I'm not going to do that. And secondly, I don't interview Nazis.
Okay.
Because believe it or not, there is a sizable, there's a small but loud Nazi element in the Hare Krishna movement, which is completely bizarre, considering the first fundamental point of Krishna consciousness is that we're not the body. Right, we're not white or Indian or German or English or Asian or Jewish, Christian, Hindu. We're not any of them. Before we have to try and understand that before we understand that the Supreme is a person and our relationship with the Supreme. So the fact that there's people, you know, that are Nazis, and they admit that they're Nazis. Yeah. Oh, Prabhupada favoured the white race. You've really taken some of those comments out of context, haven't you? There's one particular devotee. They even use that term lightly, a devotee. There's one person who says he practices Krishna consciousness, who's written a book called Srila Prabhupada and the Aryan Race. That Prabhupada favoured an Aryan race, and he was inspired by Hitler. So they're not allowed to be interviewed because that's just not, you know, it's just too much, and it's just not what we stand for.
You don't think though, because I mean, I'm just, if you don't mind a friendly challenge. Yeah, I mean, you're quite you're a very inclusive person, and I appreciate that about you, because you know, if you stuck to purely the institution which you were raised, then we wouldn't even be talking right now.
Wouldn't be allowed to talk to you.
So I think there is a virtue, of course, in being inclusive. You don't think there would be any at least interesting points to be made, or there'll be any value in like having a podcast with even these kind of people, just to see, you know, where they're coming from and challenge them?
I'd have to very seriously consider it. And I think that's a really good point, to challenge them. I've tried, and I know I'm not always very good at it, and this is one of the other criticisms. I've tried to be as neutral as possible as the interviewer. So actually, that would probably only work if there was a third person in the podcast, and they were also being adult, mature, and not shouting, and we can have a conversation about things like white supremacy.
And you just be more like a moderator.
Yeah, and I'm trying to be a moderator. Well, a conversation to moderate, you know. But also, I'm not in favour of arguing, because they would possibly both use Sastra, all the words of Prabhupada, to prove their point. And I don't like that. I really don't like that.
You feel it misrepresented.
Yeah, and the Hare Krishna movement is so small anyway. Why are we arguing amongst ourselves?
Right.
When there's work to be done.
Yeah.
This is what I get fed up about in terms of, the more sectarian wings within the Hare Krishna movement, that you've got to come to our temple and join our club and be initiated by our gurus. There are 68 million people in Britain. Let's imagine, it'd be great if this happened, 1 million of them went to, there's probably around 25 Hare Krishna temples in Britain.
Okay.
So there are about 12 ISKCON, and the other 11 or 12 are not ISKCON. Whatever we mean by not ISKCON, I think I know what that means. So let's say 1 million people went to one of those 25 temples. Fantastic. There's still 67 million other people that we've got to preach to. Why are we wasting our time? I can name you cities, towns and counties in this country that have no Hare Krishna activity at all. There's no mats, there's no sanghas, no temples, no namahatas. Cornwall is one of them. I've just named it. Who wants to go and start first?
My grandparents live in Cornwall.
Which is where you're from. I'm also from Cornwall. It's why we got on so well. We've both got Cornish history. Cornwall, as far as I'm aware, someone can write in and tell me I'm wrong, that there is no Hare Krishna representation of any sangha in Cornwall. And it's a beautiful county. Why wouldn't you go there and do some preaching and some street kirtan?
I don't think they got vegetarian pasta.
And there's probably parts of Scotland that are untouched because they're so far away.
Right. Yeah, there's all these hidden communities that we can go with a Sankirtan van, but why is it not being done?
And there's parts of England that, just haven't seen the devotees for years.
Right. Yeah, we just got messaged by one lady. She lives in Southend-on-Sea.
Oh, fab.
Yeah, I don't think there's anyone there. I don't think there's anything.
Not that I'm aware of.
So, yeah, we can go to Southend-on-Sea, why not?
Well, hopefully she'll join Bliss.
Yeah, she's
get involved
very
with
nice.
what you're doing.
She got inspired by the chanting. Yeah, so that's a good point. There's not there's a lot of work to be done and not a lot of cooperation. But I think that these different the different philosophies, that it makes it difficult. As
I mean, there's going to be some differences of opinion over the jiva, the origin of the soul, over the position of gurus and which gurus, and I completely get that.
It comes from the spiritual world, right?
Yeah, it comes from the spiritual world.
From Goloka, right?
There's division everywhere.
Okay, you're on the fence, even on my podcast.
When I wrote my book, The Hare Krishnas in Britain, I realised I needed to try and find a unifying pinpoint in terms from an academic point of view. How can all these mats fit together? And actually, for the first few months of the research, I thought that was Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada is a unifying pinpoint that brings everyone together.
Right.
I'm not contradicting what I said half an hour ago. But actually, I went back a generation and chose Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who this year we celebrate the 150th anniversary of his appearance in this miserable existence, 1874. And because I identified soon into the research that all these mats and sanghas were all actually in this, most of them are in the Sarasvat line. They come from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. There's a few others in the UK that come from the Nityananda line, but they're a very small number of them. So that was a great kind of unifying factor, was Bhaktisiddhanta Prabhupada, in terms of him kind of bringing people together. And I've waffled a bit there. I can't remember your question, but
my question was that is the jiva from
so there'll be differences of opinion on like the jiva and the position of gurus. But I think if we go back further enough, it still doesn't make sense. Far enough, you'll find something or someone that brings us together, and it might be. I feel like I'm contradicting what I said 30 minutes ago, but we might have to go back to the generation of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur to get that even more of a unifying force. I went to visit the Gaudiya Mission UK the other day. They're the oldest mat in Britain. They've been here since 1933, 35 years before ISKCON. They're like the real deal. They're the original group. Yeah, so we should go back and learn a few things from them. So all these groups that I mentioned, Bliss, the Sri Chaitanya Saraswati, the International Prabhakti Yoga Society, the Gaudiya Vedanta Samiti, the Hare Krishna Center Leicester, the Hare Krishna Project, the Sri Gopinath Gaudiya Mat, they all are in the Sarasvat line. they will all be disciples or grand disciples or great grand disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So let's focus on what we have in common and what can bring us together.
It's better than focusing on the differences, that's for sure.
Yes, such as the jiva or the nature of the soul. And, and I mean, do I want to name differences? Maybe the status or the position of women might be something that people, I mean, my personal view on this podcast, I don't even see why it's an issue. Women being in positions of authority. I mean, it's 2024 for goodness sake, but that's a personal view. But unfortunately, that's a slightly divisive issue. And also there's more kind of radical issues around homosexuality, trans rights, LGBT rights. You know, I think because I had quite a liberal upbringing, these things don't faze me. Going back to your question about things that I do get fazed by some things, like the British royal family being lizards, but ultimately things don't faze me.
Yeah.
I had a liberal upbringing. You know, I had gay friends at school. You know, we all, it's a different cultural thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So sorry to any LGBTQI devotees listening, but let's not necessarily focus on those issues. Let's focus on the things that bring us together.
Okay. Yeah, it's positive. It's
Yeah.
positive. So you mentioned previously that you were in ISKCON. That's no longer?
What a question.
I
No.
Because it's past tense.
No, yeah. Well, I had a great time in ISKCON, and I spent 15 years with them.
Because they're the biggest institution.
Yeah, they're the biggest institution in Britain, the biggest Gaudiya Vaishnava institution in the Western world, and I assume in India. I assume they're the biggest institution in India, but I'm really not sure. And a couple of years ago, we had a period of time in world history where people weren't allowed to go to work, people had to stay at home. People have different views on that. I try and avoid talking about that as well.
Okay.
We actually met during that period of time where we had to sit in the park, not in
Yeah.
each other's homes, 6 feet away from each other.
Were we breaking the law then?
No, we were following the rules
strict.
at the time that the government had set. That was something people will know about 3 or 4 years ago. But I used that time constructively. I had time at home to read and to write and to think and to reevaluate my life. Where is my life going? What do I want to do with my life? And to cut a long story short, I stopped serving in ISKCON in 2020, 2021. So I stopped doing physical service in the organization. But emotionally, whatever we mean by that, I didn't leave ISKCON until the end of 2022.
So it took a bit more time to...
It took more time, because when you're with something for so long, it's very difficult to shake that off. And I had a lot of friends in ISKCON, and I had a lot of connections, and my initial first connection with Srila Prabhupada was in the institution of ISKCON.
Brought to you by ISKCON.
Absolutely, and I appreciate everything that ISKCON did for me. But then when you start to reevaluate your life and your priorities and where you're going in your life, I realized, for a number of reasons, I didn't want to be part of ISKCON anymore. I think we have to have principles in our life, and we have to live by values.
It's good.
And I just didn't share the same values as the organization anymore. I was concerned about the organization's future. I was concerned about the way the organization treated people. I was concerned about financial irregularities in the institution. I was concerned about the very, very inappropriate top-down use of power and the abuse of people, the psychological abuse of people, not just from someone who complained once, from hundreds of people sharing their testimonies online. Consistently. And ultimately, in most societies around the world, we can judge that society based on how it treats its vulnerable.
Okay.
And in most societies, the vulnerable are the youngest and the oldest.
Right.
ISKCON for 45 years has presided over one of the biggest child abuse cover-ups in history.
Okay.
The abuse of children has been horrific.
Yeah, I was just talking to Devotee Govinda Prabhu about this topic.
Who was the first child protection director in ISKCON?
Yeah.
Who is still, despite, I think, 20 years after leaving that post, or 10, 15 years after, is still highly pumped up and glorified, actually, as someone who really took that role seriously.
Oh, yeah.
Because since then, it's just gone downhill, and I mean that in lots of different ways.
Yeah. Well, actually, he left because he said that it's is institutionalized. It's so you can't actually. The whole scheme is broken, and he couldn't fix it, even in that position that he was in, as someone who had so much power with the institution. He couldn't fix it. Therefore, he felt no option but to leave.
Yeah. And the same thing was for me, because you judge a society, you judge a group based on how it treats its vulnerable, the youngest and the oldest. And ISKCON, the way it treats its most vulnerable is appalling.
Even the old also?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, this isn't talked about as often for different reasons probably, but there is a real epidemic around how ISKCON doesn't care for elderly Prabhupada disciples, how ISKCON doesn't look after those that have served for 50 years.
Because I see the, like the guest appearance or lectures by HG such and such.
Yeah.
He's a Prabhupada early disciple. So it's not like that, eh?
Not behind the scenes.
Okay.
Don't always agree with or believe everything as they appear on the surface. No, there's a lot of issues around devotee care.
Okay.
ISKCON is trying to address that. There's lots of elderly Prabhupada disciples and older disciples of other gurus too within the institution of ISKCON that aren't being looked after, and that's a real shame. But for me, ultimately, it was around this realization that we've got a certain number of leading gurus in ISKCON that are abusing children, and then other gurus and leaders have known about it but have done nothing. Mm-hmm. Well, you're just as bad. In one sense, you're just as bad.
Implicated.
You're implicated.
Yeah.
And then really, you suddenly start to think, well, who do I believe? Who can I trust?
Right.
And then you start to think, well, I've been around for 20 years. I was at an event with that guy. He knew about that investigation and he never told me. One high profile, I am going to use this word, paedophile in ISKCON, because he's admitted to being a paedophile. He's still a paedophile and he's still in a position of authority. I helped organise an event with him once, or with his disciples. And I realised soon after that someone that was in this project I was in knew that he had admitted to being a paedophile. What are we doing here?
You feel betrayed.
I feel betrayed. I feel really angry about it. I have emails still on my laptop, thank the Lord they're still there, from leaders of ISKCON UK saying, what's fine. We knew about it all along. Yay, he was entitled to his moment of madness. Abusing children is not a moment of madness.
So you were directly contacting people about this?
Yeah,
writing.
I mean, I was involved. I was part of the National Council for 4 years in ISKCON in the UK. I was a substitute. I went because someone else couldn't be bothered to go. But actually it was great because I got to learn a lot and see how the leadership of ISKCON UK operates in terms of how it deals with difficult situations or it doesn't deal with them, how it talks about people, how it, just blindsides certain issues. So I was able to experience that management role for 4 years and I really appreciated it. It was a bit of a talking shop at times.
Talking shop?
Talking shop.
I'm not so familiar with the idiom.
Talking shop, you just talk about things because they sound good. Oh yes, Bhaktivedanta Manor, we raised this much money and, we raised, it's more public knowledge on the Charity Commission. They'll raise about £5 million at Jamashtami, donations from the Indian community. We raised £5 million and, we're doing well. I went to one meeting once and the temple... one of the leaders of Bhaktivedanta Manor at the time said, well, we're doing well on the Diwali scene now. We're getting the Hindus in. We raised 1 million this year. And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, but none of the Westerners want to go. They just don't want to go to your temple anymore. Is that something to be proud of? After what Prabhupada did and how he sacrificed so much for the Western public all those years ago? So, yeah, it was an experience. And I remember once, one sannyasi who really was trying, actually, and he was trying to get the agenda back on track. He put his hand up once and said, well, do you think maybe at one meeting we could talk about preaching and how to reach out to people? And the GBC at the time said, yeah, we'll put it on the next agenda. And it was on each agenda for about 5 months. And we talk about it for 10 minutes. We'll talk about preaching. And then we'll go back to talking about buildings and marriages and talk about, we've had another complaint. We've had another legal threat. Oh, yeah, so-and-so said this. I'm going to write to them. They can't use the ISKCON logo. And it was just like, what am I doing for 4 hours of my life?
Wow.
So I experienced
you were going to
that.
these meetings?
I was going.
Yeah, okay. You're a counsellor.
In that context there, I was representing a certain project in ISKCON, and I was going to these meetings to represent that project. So the ISKCON UK National Council are quite secretive because they don't know want you to know who the members are. But effectively, they're the temple presidents of the 12 ISKCON temples in the UK. There's often a lawyer that will go who represents ISKCON legally, someone who runs Food for All, someone who runs certain namahatas, and around 25 people go. And it's predominantly men talking about things that men want to talk about. You know, social club. There's a token. I was going to say a tokenistic woman. That sounds offensive. There's a woman that's there. That it appears that, you know, she has a role to play, but it's very tokenistic that there's one woman here.
Just for the diversity's sake.
For the diversity as well. So, yeah, that was my experiences of the ISKCON UK National Council.
So, but then, okay, so you went from the council that you didn't feel good in those meetings in particular, and then what happened then? Because
do you know what happened for me was a lot of conversations I was having with devotees in 2022 that made me realize something that I needed to realize earlier on, and that was A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada existed outside of the institution of ISKCON. And do you know what? It was meeting devotees like you that helped me with that journey and that process and that experience. And I remember speaking to one Prabhupada disciple who took initiation directly from Prabhupada in the 1970s. I had a long conversation with him around December 2022 on the phone. And he said, you know what, Narada? After Prabhupada left his body in November 77, I stuck around for about 3 months, and then I got out of there, and it was the best thing I ever did in my life, because I could still have my relationship with Prabhupada, I could still follow Prabhupada, but I wasn't going to be a part of that organization anymore. And I find it, he said to me, I find it so liberating. And he said, Narada, I know you don't like being told what to do, which is true, but I think you should do it. You need to leave ISKCON in your head. You need to get out of it. And it was one of the best pieces of advice I've ever had in my life, was to leave this organization, which I didn't share its values with anymore.
But it's a tremendous struggle, because the institution, it provides financial security, it provides validation in the preaching field, because, I mean, you know, it is a very big institution, as you mentioned, it's like 700 temples now. It is the institution that Srila Prabhupada himself made. So if you try to make a preaching effort outside of ISKCON, it appears difficult.
Well, a number of things that I recognised and realised as part of that process, in answer to your question. So I talked about this a while ago, but I'll repeat it because this is what helped me. I wasn't employed by ISKCON. I had paid employment outside of anything to do with Krishna consciousness to that extent. You know, I try and always be a Krishna conscious practitioner in all aspects of my life. So my paid income has nothing to do with the Hare Krishna movement. My family were not Hare Krishna devotees, and that helped. I've heard about other people who have tried to leave ISKCON or other mats or other groups, and they can't, or they struggle because their parents are involved, or their husband or their wife's involved. Right. So I didn't have any of that. No one in my family's interested. You know, so that really helped me. But then. And I guess my research from my book, you could say it was Krishna's arrangement, because I was already discovering all these different devotees and mats and sanghas that weren't part of the institution of ISKCON. So in my head, that network already existed outside or independently from the institution of ISKCON. And who are those devotees that are not within the institution of ISKCON, where they're followers in other mats, that I've mentioned those mats a number of times. But then you recognize and you identify there's a large number of devotees that are followers of Srila Prabhupada that are not part of the institution of ISKCON. And actually, there's a lot of them. I mean, I don't want to put a number and say it's the thousands, but it possibly could be. There's certainly hundreds in Britain. And not only did you find individuals that were followers of Prabhupada outside the institution of ISKCON, you started to find that there were groups of them, organized groups of them, mats, Sangha. So mat, I think, literally means mission. I've used this word a lot in this podcast. And there was lots of them that were independent of the ISKCON GBC, but they had taken shelter of Srila Prabhupada. And all of a sudden, you get to meet them and you form relationships with them, you know. And one of them is the Bhaktivedanta Lives in Science Society, which is a wonderful group of devotees Bliss, by the way, who are following Prabhupada sincerely, trying their hardest, and they're getting on with it. Another one is the Radha Kripa Mission in France, who are following Srila Prabhupada sincerely and getting on with the preaching. And you find there's this whole life that's very liberating out of the institution of ISKCON, where you are allowed to have your own opinion.
Right.
You are allowed to...
without the GBC coming
yeah,
in.
you are allowed to talk to people in other mats. I always find that very difficult because of my background. So that was a very liberating thing. And I know that not everyone would find that easy because their whole life is ISKCON. I know people that are employed by ISKCON. According to the Charity Commission, they've got 150 paid staff in Britain. I haven't got a clue what they do or who they are, but there's 150 paid staff. They would struggle. I know people that have been born in the movement within the institution of ISKCON. Their parents are, within the institution of ISKCON. I know a woman whose her grandfather's passed away. He was an initiating guru in ISKCON. Their life is all about ISKCON.
Right.
But thankfully, in this context, I didn't have those problems. My life would move on without the institution, and I'd be very happy, and I am very happy.
Okay, that's good news. It's kind of like people in America, they have this thing that there's American students, they find it difficult to conceive that there's any other country outside of America, and the whole education system basically says that it's just history. I was living in America. History is American history.
Yeah.
And that is history.
Which started in 1776.
Very, very recent. So, but still, the history revolves all around that. So, yeah, there is a little danger, maybe you could say, in institutionalism, but there's also, benefits, right? So, it's difficult.
There's pros and cons of everything in life, and for a lot of people, being part of the institution of ISKCON is very beneficial to them and their families, and that's fine.
Right.
I'm all for that. If that's what works for them, that's fine. And there is ISKCON's history, and everyone else's view of history. It can be the same on certain topics. I remember going to an ISKCON event once where I was allowed to talk about my book, and you
were allowed.
I was allowed. It was great, actually. I loved it.
It's not usual.
We were talking about Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. This was an ISKCON meeting. So I try and be interactive with my discussions, and I said, how many disciples did Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur have? And a few people put their hand up. One lady put her hand up and said, he had one. Yeah, he had just one disciple. And I sat there and I thought, well, does she really think this? So obviously she quite rightly thought Srila Prabhupada, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Absolutely, I got that. But she hadn't been told that actually there were hundreds, possibly thousands. I haven't got the exact figure, a number of disciples.
Maths, so.
There were a lot of disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So there was the history that she had been told, of her view of reality, to actually what was actually true and accurate. Yeah, and on the American thing, I think only 8% of Americans have passports.
Yeah.
And I remember when the Ukraine war started, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they went around a typical American street with a map of the world. Can you point to Ukraine? And at least half the people pointed to Texas.
Wow. Because
they just didn't have a clue where Ukraine was.
That's quite inaccurate.
Which is very sad, actually.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Mm. Yeah, well, that's interesting. There's an interesting point about how many disciples Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had, because I guess it does depend also on your angle or vision or how you define things, as there are with many things in life. It depends on your definition.
How you define disciple.
Yeah.
How you define follower. Are we only talking about the sannyas disciples, or Prabhupada wasn't a sannyas disciple, by the way.
Yeah.
He was given sannyas later on, and different mats will have different views on their guru being the rightful successor as well, and that still exists today in different ways.
Right. So you from the ISKCON, there's not many political issues or how they deal with their public relations. That's for you. That's just not acceptable.
Yeah, it is not acceptable. The reasons why I decided not to be part of the institution of ISKCON anymore. The child abuse, the abuse of members, the misuse of charity funds, the top-down hierarchical approach, the lack of free speech. And I'm not saying you should go around saying anything everything that you want. I'm not saying that, but just the lack of being able to have an opinion. And one of the things that I appreciate elsewhere is that a devotee or an aspiring devotee can ask a difficult question and they'll get an answer. In ISKCON, often the favourite answer from the leading gurus is, well, that's offensive, you shouldn't ask that.
Okay.
Well, when are they ever going to get the answer then to the questions that I have?
Right.
And I've always been a bit of a fan of free speech, to some appropriate free speech. You can't go around insulting people, but you have to have a safe space or environment. And that's what we do at the Hare Krishna Project, the organisation that I'm part of. We try and create that safe space where you can ask any question, as crazy as it may sound, and we will answer it, or we will get an answer for you.
So because you mentioned now this Hare Krishna organisation that you have,
Yeah.
you can talk a little bit more about that, because that's interesting. You've now formed that outside of ISKCON. What's the mission there in your organisation? What's the philosophy behind it?
It's evolved a bit since the Hare Krishna Project was set up in 2021, but ultimately it's a I don't like this word, but I'm going to use it because the listeners will know. It's a preaching initiative. Preaching sounds a bit religious. It's a preaching initiative where our number one aim is to share the philosophy of Krishna consciousness with the West. So we do school programs, we organise Hare Krishna festivals, we give public talks, we from time to time we'll give information and advice to the media. Another topic, bit of a tangent, the media are currently doing a big story on a particular issue that's linked to ISKCON, and they've recently got in touch with the Hare Krishna Project to ask for our views, because they know that in my paid life I work in the media. So we often work with the media, we organise events and activities and festivals, we do book distribution. Our focus is to distribute Prabhupada's original books, those are unedited, and we also produce a podcast. But for me, I think we've kind of positioned ourselves on the more kind of liberal, progressive wing of the movement, and often you won't find devotees admitting to that. That doesn't mean that we're morally liberal. It means we're more socially liberal, in the sense that, to me personally, it doesn't matter whether you wear a dhoti or not. It doesn't matter how you identify with your sexuality. It doesn't matter whether you're living with your partner when you're married or not.
You're more concerned with the essence.
Yeah, exactly. I want to create an environment, or the organisation that we've created, where you can feel a sense of belonging, or you can feel a sense of inclusion. You know, I get emails, no exaggeration, almost every day from devotees all over the world, and I'm sorry I can't respond so quickly. People are saying, oh, we love what you do. So I gave a series of talks last year on inclusive Vaishnavism. Now, I was talking about inclusive Vaishnavism because I'm passionate about inclusion, and also because no one else was talking about it. So to be crystal clear, in my head, inclusive Vaishnavism is different from progressive Vaishnavism. That's also a movement within the Hare Krishna movement called progressive Vaishnavism, and that's about being progressive and perhaps being a bit more modern, and that's fab. And I would probably label myself as a progressive, but I also want to include those that are not progressive. I want the traditionalists to be included.
That's even more progressive.
Yeah, I want those that are more conservative to be, or to feel included, because even though I might not agree with them, I want them to have their say and to be included. So we started a series of talks on inclusive Vaishnavism last year. So I gave a talk about LGBT issues, I gave a talk about racism within the Hare Krishna movement, which unfortunately exists. And because of those talks, I still get people emailing me from around the world saying, no one else is talking about what you're talking about. We really appreciate it, Prabhu, that you've put your head above the parapet and you've just said it. I mean, my response is, well, I've got nothing to lose, you know. My mother still loves me, whether I do these talks or not. You know?
Mother's a secure, she's a secure
Exactly,
ground.
exactly. Yeah. And just recently, I don't know if any viewers or listeners watched it, there was a TV series on the BBC called, it was about my coming out life. So they did Christianity one week and Judaism the next week, and it was someone who was Jewish coming out as gay, someone who was Hindu coming out as gay. And I watched that program literally 3 weeks ago on iPlayer, just because I thought it was interesting. And there was a couple, 2 men, and the BBC went to their house, and they had Gauranatai deities.
Wow.
And they had Prabhupada, and I said to the devotee I was with at the time, I need to meet these guys, I just want to interview them.
Right.
5 days ago, the guy that was on the BBC documentary emails me.
Wow, just see Krishna.
He says, "Oh, you might have." In the email, he said, "We just appeared on the BBC documentary about that particular issue," and I'm looking for like someone else online who at least agrees with what we're doing, and you're the only one I can find. So that's a small example. You know, I've done a lot of work around supporting others. I mean, I've been a very loud, outspoken voice on women being gurus. Again, what do we mean by guru, and how do we define gurus? But you know, I've created a space where that conversation can kind of take place as well. So, at the Hare Krishna Project, we're very passionate about inclusion. We're very passionate about I don't like this word, but tolerance. I'm going to tolerate you, but we're going to try and include you as much as we can. You know, and that's, you know, one of the things that we do, and it's working. You know, I can't keep up with all the emails. If I'm honest, I need to employ a PA. Anyone that's interested.
That's good news. Okay. How do you deal with the social media aspect? Because I can also see you're quite prolific on social media. We do a lot of work with social media also, and it's intense. It's like a different universe. You know, it doesn't operate necessarily by all the same. It's like a whole different set of laws.
Yeah.
And how do you deal with that?
Well, firstly, I want to say I think Bliss's social media is amazing. It's far better than the Hare Krishna projects.
I'm trying to plug you.
I'm in awe of you in terms of what you do. But yes, we've got a very large following now, and I'm going to use this expression. You have to be on it all the time.
Okay.
You know, when I leave this podcast in the BBC studios, I might look at my phone, or how many notifications have I got now? Okay. And that's not because I was about to say I'm not attached. Of course I'm attached. I'm in the material world. That's not about me wanting to read everything straight away. It's just make sure everything's
up to date,
and also appropriate. One of my podcasts online at the moment, another controversial podcast it was, and
most recent one.
I recently interviewed a sannyasi in ISKCON.
Yeah.
I was very surprised that he agreed to be on the podcast. And I said to his disciple who arranged the recording with me, I said, people are entitled to their views, but no one's allowed to be abused. My guests cannot be abused. So I don't tolerate abuse. So I just delete abuse. It's not acceptable. I don't report it to Facebook, I just delete it.
Okay.
So I have to keep an eye on my social media channels.
On the comment section.
Comments, yeah. People are allowed to have their views, right. Absolutely, and you can give those views if they're constructive, but don't abuse the guest, and don't abuse me either. I won't put up with it.
Right.
Facebook makes it very easy for me to block you, thankfully. So there isn't complete free speech. Social media, yeah, is really important, and you know, most of our followers, the Hare Krishna Project's followers, are from people all around the world. And social media is so good at connecting people. You know, we can use almost anything in the service of Krishna if it's done appropriately. You know, I'm sure if Prabhupada was physically present today, he would love Facebook. He'd love podcasts.
Yeah,
well, he can use it for Krishna.
Yeah.
He can talk about Krishna. Reach even more people.
Yeah.
You know, there's one... I won't say his name. There's one guru and one mat. I've actually forgotten his name. That's terrible. There's one guru and one mat. He's told all of his disciples just to do digital preaching every day.
Only?
Just do digital preaching. And I think only. I mean, not distributing books sounds like a bit of a heresy, doesn't it? Or treason. But he's saying, no, just do Facebook Live. And I know one particular mat, all their members do Facebook Live every single day.
Individually.
You know, they even just film themselves chanting. I mean, I wouldn't do that necessarily. I like to be a bit more private, but that's so when these forms of communication are used properly, they can be so powerful. I mean, I'm about to mention Pierce Morgan is a slightly controversial journalist. Why am I mentioning him on this podcast? He's recently decided to stop doing his controversial chat show, which is on Talk TV on weeknights, and only air it on YouTube.
Ah, okay.
Because he said it'll have a global audience and more people can watch it. So it's not going to be on the actual Talk TV channel anymore. It's going to be just on YouTube.
Okay.
What a brave move, because he recognises that the internet is so powerful.
Right.
Kind of linked to that, David Attenborough did a documentary about 2 years ago. He said it's only going to be on Netflix. Because this message about the environment needs an international audience. It shouldn't be just kept in the UK. So if we use these forms of communication properly, we can use them properly. We can use them effectively to spread and share Krishna consciousness with more people.
I'm shocked sometimes at the amount of criticism or backlash that people who use the internet and modern technology for the propagation of Krishna consciousness receive, because it's some kind of demoniac force. I don't know, do you ever receive messages like this?
That social media is a demonic force?
Social media, especially the use of AI. I don't know if are you using AI?
I don't have a view on AI because I don't know enough about it. I know you guys use AI. I don't have a view about it either way. I don't see a problem with it. I think it depends what AI is used for.
Like anything.
Do I like the idea of robots taking over the world? No, but it's not going to happen. So why even worry about it?
Yeah. I've got to agree with you that I also don't like the idea of them taking over the world.
But AI to produce lovely, beautiful graphics, why not? Saves time.
Yeah, saves time.
Used for the service of Krishna.
Yeah. Yukta vairagya uchate. You can't, if you give up something artificially, that's also not good. So, yeah, okay, so that's nice, social media. Because I see it's very active, the Facebook. And you have this other page, Hare Krishna News and Events.
That's not my page. That's a page that I'm part of. Yeah,
you're just an admin.
I'm one of them. There's a lot of people involved with that page, and it gets a whole traction's the word. Yeah, that page has evolved over the years, but my predominant platform is the Hare Krishna Project, which is on YouTube and on Facebook. And I've actually learned from Bliss in terms of you produce something like a film, a video, and you share it on thousands and thousands of groups, and it's amazing how much impact it has. You know, I'll produce a podcast, and within a few hours, it will have 1,000 views.
You also share?
Yeah, I share loads. You know, at 7 o'clock it goes out, share. You have to be on it.
That'd be £500, please.
£500, yeah.
Secrets don't go so cheap.
Well, you guys definitely need more donations for the work you do. It's amazing what you do here at Bliss.
Well, we appreciate people who appreciate, so that's thank you.
Hare Krishna.
So the Hare Krishna Project, very nice. You have temples.
No, we don't have. We're more like a traveling. No, that is not part of our grand plan. We are a traveling preaching team. As a group of us, a small group of us, we travel around the country and other parts of Europe, doing festivals and events. We do a lot of stuff online. You know, we've got a number of events this month.
Great.
And what we're trying to do through our practices is we're trying to practice what we preach in terms of collaboration and working together. So, you know, I've mentioned it a bit on some of my broadcasts recently. I'm doing a bit of work I'm doing a lot of work behind the scenes to try and bring different groups together, because a lot of groups are trying to achieve the same thing in terms of sharing the teachings of Srila Prabhupada with the Western public. Are there any opportunities for us to work together? And I'm trying to do that, identifying things that we have in common. At the end of this month, I'm going to visit the Hare Krishna Centre in Leicester, which is one of the very few standalone independent Hare Krishna temples in Europe that's under the shelter of Prabhupada. And I'm going to visit them for their Gaura Purnima festival at the end of the month. And I'm really excited about that, Those that follow the Hare Krishna Project know that I've carried out 2 visits to the Radha Kripa mission in northwest France over the last 6 months. Rouen. Yeah. Nice. Amazing city and wonderful devotees, and I like their maverick style. And as you know, as much as possible, I try and come and visit the Bliss Temple here in South London because I appreciate what you do.
We wish it was more.
I support what you do, and we largely share the same values. You know, we're trying to achieve the same thing. So, and what I've found is that I'm now going around and telling people about what they're doing, and actually, why don't we try and just connect together and work together? And that's not about stepping on each other's toes, because our toes aren't big enough. But actually, you know, and then you have a conversation with the United States. Well, actually, I've just had the same conversation with someone in Spain last week. So I'll give you his email address, and all of a sudden I've become this kind of central person that I never wanted to be a central person that just connects people. I'm like a connector.
It's the nature of your work.
Yeah, I mean, for a living, I run community engagement projects for businesses.
Right.
I work in marketing. Businesses pay me to create links between themselves and the community. So I think of all these ideas. How can we create connections? You know, what is it about your business that the public will like? There'll be some things that they might not like, but what do they like? How can we sell your business to the public? So community engagement is kind of what I do. So I'm using those, so Prabhupada said, there's certain things of course we shouldn't be doing. We'd actually said, particularly with your life, just add Krishna. If you're talented or skilled at something, dovetail it and use it for the service of Krishna.
Right.
So I'm like a community engagement social worker in the Hare Krishna movement. I go around like connecting people up and trying to, join the dots.
Nice.
And I love it. I really love it. I love meeting people. I love encouraging people. I love supporting people.
It's a hopeful vision.
Yeah.
To see everyone connected.
Yeah, and I'm not planning, I've mentioned once already in this podcast, I'm 40 this year. I'm not planning on going anywhere anytime soon.
Mm.
So I hope in 20 years' time, you and I can chat again. And we can have a conversation. Wow, look what's happened over 20 years. What have we achieved for Srila Prabhupada by working together?
Hopefully we get a better table by that time.
20 years' time,
Not so
this will be in the Bliss Museum, I think. We'll have a museum by then.
Okay, you'll help us make that one.
Yes, if you want, we'll open a museum.
Thank you. How do you because you mentioned the connecting other people.
Yeah.
How do you view the guru in Hare Krishna projects? How the Hare Krishna project? How do you view that? Because it is quite an important factor, especially in Hare Krishna. Would you call it theology?
I like the word theology,
Yeah.
but it's not a word we use often in Gaudiya Vaishnava circles. We use the word philosophy instead. Theology and philosophy are different.
They're different.
What's our official view on the guru?
Yeah.
Well, as it says on our website, we follow the teachings of Srila Prabhupada.
Okay.
We are passionate about Prabhupada, and we want to share Prabhupada with the website. Then it's getting towards the end of the day with the public.
Okay.
But we would probably I call it social libertarianism.
Wow.
Which is another political term, which means different things to different people. We would take a social libertarian view on who your guru is and who your guru is. I will always try and respect you as much as I can, even if I disagree with you.
As an individual.
I like to live in a society where we have differences of opinion and we can disagree but still be friends. Or still break bread together. That's what I'm interested in. So we will follow the teachings of Prabhupada. I have a lot of friends that are in the line of Srila Maharaj. I have the utmost respect for Srila Maharaj. And, he was also very much revered by Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada made lots of statements about his godbrother, Srila Maharaj. But we just don't happen to have Srila Maharaj on our website. He's not on that particular page, he's actually mentioned on another one. So for me, it's about the guru issue. If someone came to me today and said, what do you advise that I should do? I would say, take shelter of Srila Prabhupada.
Okay.
And read Srila Prabhupada's books.
You have an expression. You have a particular expression.
Yeah.
Srila Prabhupada is a safe pair of hands.
It's a safe pair of hands.
Nice, I like this.
Now, we will even have differences of opinion over words like Diksha and Shiksha, but ultimately, Srila Prabhupada is a safe pair of hands. Read Srila Prabhupada's books, chant the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. If you're new, start by 1 round or 2 rounds a day, and we try and follow the example that Prabhupada taught, a minimum of 16 rounds a day. Just follow Srila Prabhupada. That's the advice that we give, and it works. I mentioned this on a podcast recently, and I'll mention it on this one. For some bizarre reason, every now and then people get in touch with me at the Hare Krishna Project, and they ask me for advice on initiation. Oh, well, I want to take initiation from so-and-so, what's your advice? So I will give my views, and the great thing I think about the Hare Krishna community, there are lots of different types of initiation, and there are different ways you can get initiated. Your focus actually shouldn't be on getting initiated necessarily, on the act or the activity. It should be on the spiritual process or that relationship with a spiritual teacher or guide and with Krishna himself. But ultimately, people ask me about advice on initiation, and I think I'm about to answer your question in a long-winded way. At the moment, I would recommend that nobody takes initiation within the institution of ISKCON. I might not have that view forever, hopefully I won't, but at the moment, in terms of until ISKCON deals with all of its issues around child abuse and sexual abuse and inappropriate use of funds and abuse of people and psychological damage and mental health and domestic violence, the list is endless. That would be my advice right now. There are gurus in other mats. I would say, well, go and send him an email or read his books, and there are a number of mats, all in the Sarasvat line that I would recommend. But also I recognise that some people very fondly follow what we could call Ritvik philosophy or the Ritvik order. And that's also great. And I'll give some recommendations on this group will follow the Ritvik order or Ritvik philosophy. And there's a number of them in Britain, and you can connect with them. And and here's their email address, and this is their Facebook page. So I want you to make the decision for yourself. Mm. You are an individual. I can advise you, but ultimately your relationship with God is your relationship.
So you don't hold any particular view on which, if it's philosophically in line, or if it's a deviation. You're more concerned with giving people that opportunity to just make the decision themselves.
Yeah, I mean, there's been. Do you know what? I find this quite difficult, this conversation with you, because I've been so neutral.
Yeah.
On my podcast for 3 years.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm coming out with these things. I was about to name one mat I would encourage people not to be initiated in. It's not ISKCON, it's another one. But I'm going to hold off because their practices are very different from everyone else. And I interviewed one of their members recently, and I don't want to upset him because I actually don't like to upset people. But their practices are very different from ours.
Okay.
I'll give you one radically different one. It's okay to eat meat.
Yeah, I am.
Now, you might say that's not actually Gaudiya Vaishnavism. That's another conversation, another issue in itself, is that Gaudiya Vaishnav. Right. I personally wouldn't recommend initiation in that mat.
Yeah.
But that one, and ISKCON for different reasons. Yeah, and I, again, a personal preference is to take initiation in the Sarasvat line. Sorry to all of my friends that are not in the Sarasvat line. I've got a lot and I love them dearly. But, I really recognise the power in the teachings of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, which have been passed down to all of his disciples. Srila Prabhupada, Keshava Maharaj, Srila Maharaj, Puri Maharaj, Daita Madhava Maharaj, and in their lines, I think that would be my suggestion. Yeah.
I guess it does depend a little bit on how you actually define initiation in the first place.
Yes.
Because as you mentioned yourself, there's the ceremony, and then there's the process and the relationship that you have with the spiritual teacher. So, different institutions, they define initiation differently.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's also possibly a schism because of the terms used only. I think sometimes that's also just a difficult.
Yeah, I've kind of alluded to them already. Terms like particularly Diksha.
Yeah.
Can be interpreted in different ways.
Yeah, and it is. And
I actually don't think that's helpful, but it's not something I stay awake about it, like worrying about. I've got this stuff to worry about in terms of how we define Diksha, Again, ultimately, we've talked a bit about the Ritvik philosophy here. Do you know what? I'm going to be honest now. One of the things I'm most proud of is a lot of people think I'm a Ritvik.
Oh, really?
And I'm not.
Okay.
Now, why I'm proud of it is because I've given such an impression to the public through my podcast and my focus on Prabhupada. People think I'm a Ritvik because I'm not serving with the institution of ISKCON anymore. I am personally not.
Why not? Because you are you are quite enthused. I mean, again, I don't know if you defined here what is Ritvik, but you are quite enthusiastic about Srila Prabhupada.
Well, everyone's enthusiastic about Prabhupada.
But you seem to be solely enthusiastic about Srila Prabhupada, and you encourage people to take shelter of Srila Prabhupada.
Because he's a safe pair of hands that's unifying.
Yeah.
Whether you're a Ritvik or not.
But then what is a Ritvik?
Well, my understanding, again, this is an interesting concept, Ritvik.
Yeah.
So my understanding of, okay, we're going around in circles here, yeah. But in terms of, in common, in our language, in our vernacular, when we say Ritvik,
yeah.
We're referring to, we're using in the context of someone who follows the Ritvik order, which was featured in a letter that Srila Prabhupada wrote on July the 9th, 1977.
Okay.
And it was a letter about future initiations after Prabhupada.
Specifically after he departed.
Yeah, and it was around about ISKCON and things like that. So, as you can imagine, I spent 15, 16 years of ISKCON, and it was really drummed into you that the Ritviks were horrible people, really horrible people. You should have nothing to do with them. And I remember
themselves.
Yeah, and I remember thinking, well, this must be very kind of terrifying. And I remember interviewing my first ever guest that was a follower of the Ritvik order. And I wasn't nervous about it. I was just thinking, my goodness, what am I doing?
Mm-hmm.
And after that, some people contacted me, oh, well done, Narada, you're so brave. And I think, we just had a conversation. We've been brave. It was a young woman who's now a friend of mine. I don't know if she's going to listen to this podcast. You know, we had a very heated discussion. I think it was episode 16. It was a long time ago. I've just done 112. So my understanding of the Ritvik order is this recognition that after Srila Prabhupada, there should be no more Diksha Gurus. So Srila Prabhupada is the ultimate guru, and henceforth from now, this point in time, everyone who joins ISKCON or the Hare Krishna movement should be a follower of mine or a disciple of mine. And Ritviks, another use of the term, could be priests or substitutes that will initiate on my behalf. So ultimately, actually, the followers of Prabhupada can be divided into two groups: those that follow the Ritvik order, and those that don't.
But there is even within those definitions, there's actually very little difference, because if you take it, Srila Prabhupada, people who might not necessarily identify as followers of the 1977 letter, they do read Srila Prabhupada's books, they do follow Srila Prabhupada's spiritual practice, the regulations that he gave, and they preach the exact same philosophy that he gave. So then, what does it mean to really be a follower or a disciple of Srila Prabhupada? Because if it means to follow his teachings, follow his instructions, and point to him as a spiritual
authoritative figure,
that sounds like
the authoritative spiritual figure for this age.
So, apart from saying I accept the letter or not, there seems to be very little difference between.
Well, within the institution of ISKCON, there'll be a big difference, because if none of the Diksha Gurus after Prabhupada were recognized, then they would have not very little purpose. They still have a role, but they wouldn't have the status they have now. And ISKCON currently has around 82 initiating Diksha Gurus. So it would remove their role as Diksha Gurus and just make them representatives of Prabhupada, which they are as well. This is all actually, we're having a conversation about semantics, which is the use of language.
Right.
You and I might be trying to describe the same thing, possibly, but actually we're describing it in different ways.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I'm saying.
I can't believe I'm coming off the fence. How much hate mail am I going to get after this?
It's already bad enough.
Add some more to the mailbox, I'll open them next Monday, And
I already gave you all the plugs.
I personally don't follow the Ritvik order in that way, is because I believe that the Ritvik order existed, but that particular order ceased on November the 15th, 1977. It was an order that was put in place to manage the organisation of ISKCON during a period of time when Prabhupada was unable to travel and he was ill. Also, Ritvikism isn't theologically, historically, part of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. You do find it in other mats, but it's very minimal. And it's not such a big issue as it has been in ISKCON. I went to a Sri Chaitanya Saraswat event a couple of years ago. That's the Sridhar Maharaj group. And someone said they just got initiated. And I said, oh, who by? They said the name. I said, yeah, but he's in India. Oh, yeah, but so-and-so was the Ritvik. All right. We're in ISKCON. For me, it's not necessarily theologically correct in terms of our historical understanding of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Does that, I'm going to contradict myself now, does that necessarily mean you have to have a living guru? I don't know.
If you don't have a living guru, and if you don't have a...
But even you yourself,
yeah.
I don't want to kind of, you're interviewing me, I don't want to put you, put you into a corner. Even you yourself, there will be a person or people that are physically alive now that you would consider a guru with a small g. This person's inspired me. Without this person, I won't be doing what I'm doing today. Actually, this person has connected me to Prabhupada.
Of course.
So there is that line, there is that parampara that absolutely exists for me personally.
Sure. I mean, that's I think, the philosophy, semantics aside, that many people would agree to. That But it is undeniable, as you have mentioned, that Srila Prabhupada he's a guru with a big G. Because
I agree with
because
that.
he wrote all those books, and he made he presented Krishna consciousness in English language. He made it followable by Westerners. It was 64 rounds before Srila Prabhupada came. Now it's 16 rounds. So there are major indicators, which Srila Prabhupada has predicted in the Shastra, and so on. So these are major indicators that there's a guru with a big G.
Absolutely.
But it's also an undeniable fact that if you become inspired by Srila Prabhupada, you're also going to follow, you're also going to preach, and inevitably you're also going to inspire people. So then you're also a guru, but maybe with a small G. I think that's more of like an observable fact of reality, just by a study, an objective study of what's happened in the Hare Krishna movement and what the Hare Krishna philosophy, when practiced, it brings, rather than a philosophical view. Even it's more just like an analysis.
But actually, my kind of objective view is, to me, it doesn't. I'm not bothered.
Yeah.
I don't have sleepless nights about how people define themselves in terms of Ritviks or not.
Yeah. Well, it's not so important. The terminology.
Yeah, and I think of my friends who would use the label Ritviks, or might have done in the past. They're very good friends of mine, and I agree with them that we should distribute Prabhupada's books, and we should distribute Prasadam, and we should try and change the world, and unfortunately these divisions exist in all religious movements, and it even exists in the Hare Krishna movement. Interestingly, there's also, the Ritvik movement, if you like, is also divided.
Yes.
More than I ever thought it was.
Yeah.
And even Ritviks themselves argue over this and that, and I just think it's sad. Because I'm a wishy-washy liberal that wants people just to work together. I often joke about this, but this is quite my view of, what are we going to do on my 40th birthday party? I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're all going to sit in a field together, in a circle. We're going to sing Kumbaya, my Lord, on a guitar, chant Hare Krishna, and make daisy chains.
Are we invited?
Of course you can come.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, all these other things that are going on in the world don't really matter. Let's just be happy.
Yeah.
I mean, I sound a bit too liberal when I say that. Let's focus on what we've got in common,
Yes.
rather than what divides us.
Ultimately, yeah. If you take shelter of Srila Prabhupada, then there really is very little difference. I would say it's nominal. It's just like, what shade of dhoti, or are you wearing a dhoti at all? It's not such an important thing. He's not even wearing a dhoti. And
I'm not wearing a dhoti.
You're not wearing
I have a dhoti. I wear it like once a year if I have to.
Yeah. But what you're saying, I agree with that 100%. That Srila Prabhupada is guru with a big G.
Yeah.
We should find the similarities. So what you're wearing is not so important to me, and how you identify is also not so important. But anyway, I was just curious, how you
Put me on the spot. I wasn't expecting that question today.
Krishna gave me I had to take the opportunity. You're always on the fence in your podcast, and you're a very interesting person. So I wanted to see, more.
Who knows the real Narada Das?
Who knows the real Narada?
Only very few people.
Maybe we'll label the podcast like that. But I don't want to give you too much more hate mail than you already.
Add it to the bag. Anyway.
You're quite an open recipient of criticism, though. You don't mind.
Yeah, because
Makes you
I've put
stronger.
myself out there, and now I just kind of laugh it off.
Yeah.
I laugh it off. I mean, yeah, you get used to it.
Do you welcome it?
When I produce on every podcast, at the beginning, at the end, I say I would really love to hear your feedback.
Yeah.
Please make it constructive.
Okay.
I want to hear about what you think about this podcast and other stuff we're doing at the Hare Krishna Project.
Right.
It has to be constructive. One particular podcast I did recently with an ISKCON sannyasi. It will narrow it down because I interview very few ISKCON sannyasis. I just recently interviewed him, and somebody who doesn't agree with this ISKCON sannyasi, he's learned, I think, from the past, and he's put a criticism, but it's really nice. It's a nice criticism.
It's
constructive, and you can tell really behind his keyboard is. But he's being very diplomatic about his criticism of this ISKCON sannyasi. He talks about child abuse in ISKCON, issues in ISKCON, but he does it in a mature and adult way. Fine.
That's appreciated.
That's allowed.
Right.
Thank you. Let's try and be adults.
Okay. Well, on that note, if anyone has any constructive criticism or feedback for this podcast, please let us know down in the comments. And thank you, Narada Prabhu, for joining us on this podcast. It was pretty exciting, at least for me. I thought it was a very enlivening conversation. So thank you, and thank you for tolerating. So Hare Krishna Project.
Hare Krishna.
Ideal.
It was great to be here at the BBC studios today.
I'm going to coin that term.
It's great to be here. Thank you for including me and inviting me. That's
you.
what I really appreciate. I want everyone to be included, to feel included.
Jai. So, also I just want to mention that Narada Prabhu, he brought us today Murti, worshipable figure of Srila Prabhupada, which we'll be installing in our temple very soon. So, thank you also for that.
Hare Krishna.
So all goes to Srila Prabhupada, who makes all this possible. And thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna.